And then there was a Navy ship, and a similar story, out on the ocean during the Vietnam War, and this ship supposedly picked up radio transmissions from 20 years prior of Japanese and American fighter pilots from World War II. So evidently these broadcasts were lingering in the stratosphere, and they somehow got refracted back down to the airwaves above the ship, and the ship began picking up waves from possibly a quarter of a century before. So then over the radio came these ghostly radio sound images from decades in the past. Think of what a radio is. What do radios contain? Oh, those old radios, those old vintage ones. They contain primarily small quartz crystals. They're used to create precise, stable frequencies by tuning and modulation. Radios use crystalline oscillators. So now I want you to look at a radio in a different way than ever before. Radios have crystals in them. And the old vintage radios used to have mercury oxide batteries and mercury vapor rectifier tubes. These vintage radios, the high quality ones at least, used silver components and had a superior electrical conductivity because of the silver. Another element used in vintage radios was tin. They had tin-plated shielding on transistors, and as the radio would begin to operating, the tin would begin to grow crystals, and that somehow caused electrical shorts. Now I want you to consider the actual elements used in these, which I have said are crystals, mercury, silver, and tin, that put in together in the right patterns could draw in voices and music, which otherwise would have remained inaudible. Now listen to this. Remember that as I go into the next part of this, that within old vintage radios, like I said, using crystals, mercury, silver, and tin, and other elements, and in these elements were components which, arranged in the right manner, were effective in drawing in voices and radio frequencies from the invisible realm of radio. And one of the main components was crystals. Now, with this being said, I want to tell you about the alchemy of a looking glass. The looking glasses from several hundred years ago, which were made different than they are now. A looking glass is a mirror. And what went into these? We are speaking of the alchemy of old mirrors. In particular, these old type of mirrors, which were called old Venetian mirrors, some of these mirrors came from Vienna, London, Paris, and parts of Russia. Parts of Russia that were at one time considered to be part of the Tartarian Empire. Remember how I told you that old vintage radios were made from crystals, mercury, silver, and tin? And the substances arranged in certain combinations became an antenna that could pick up invisible voices from radio world? Well, old Venetian mirrors were also made from crystals, mercury, silver, and tin. These mirrors were made out of many of the same substances that old vintage radios were made of. These old mirrors were made with crystalline glass, which was designed to imitate expensive rock crystal. These antique mirrors used tin and mercury rather than modern silvering. They don't use that type of stuff that they used to in mirrors anymore. The mirrors developed a crystalline appearance. The crystalline clarity was achieved by adding quartz pebbles and some other substances. These types of mirrors were made of some of the same substances as radio receivers, and European royalty highly prized these types of mirrors. They were often considered as precious as gemstones. They were living mirrors. They don't use those same elements for mirrors in the modern day. The old ones were living. The ones today are like dead. Now remember the stories I told you earlier of certain elements put together, and hidden sounds and voices could be picked up by using these radio devices, even radio waves from the past, and this has something to do with electromagnetic fields of the earth. Well, back in the day, back when they had these type of Venetian mirrors, researchers and physicists would place magnetometers near these old Venetian mirrors, and the needles would fluctuate. Don't take my word for it. Ask AI or Google it. Could old Venetian mirrors interfere with the magnetic compass if placed in close proximity? And it will tell you yes. So these mirrors were not only reflectors, but also possibly receivers, similar to old vintage radios. And would that really surprise you, seeing as to how all of these old amalgam mirrors were made of some of the same substances as radio receivers? Now look up skywave ionospheric refraction. That when short wave and medium wave radio signals can bounce in between the ionosphere and the Earth's surface, it can allow them to travel vast distances and pick up old broadcasts. You may not have considered this, but consider the alchemy of old Venetian mirrors. They were made according to rigorous standards and certain recipes. Those mirrors were considered gemstones. And there were elite families that had secret recipes for those old mirrors because they were worth a fortune, a whole year's wages. Venetian glass masters could not reveal the secret mirror recipes. To do so was punishable by death. And over a period of 150 years, according to reports, 20 of these glass masters were either murdered or mysteriously vanished when they tried to get away from the island of Maramo, where the mirrors were made. Because they were supposed to be the guardians of secret looking glass knowledge from a previous civilization, according to some reports. People widely proclaimed that after twilight, during the night, and these types of mirrors, that some people claimed that they seen other times and places appearing in these looking glasses. Images would appear to them in the mirrors, according to reports. Some of them are reported to have been previous owners of the mansions that these people lived in, because mostly rich people had these things. And people having these mirrors made out of some of the same materials as radio receivers began reporting that strange people were looking back at them and reacting to them from the other side of the mirrors. Look this up. There was a thing called mirror madness, where they thought it was like a sickness that people had. And people reported seeing their towns and their homes with different architecture and different time periods. So say like you go to a mirror. When you see your image in a mirror, what has happened? An image of you has traveled on light waves and then struck the mirror, and you see an image of yourself. But what happens to that image of you on the light waves after it struck the mirror? Is it still traveling on a light wave? Light ray? Now look at the common practice at that time. And don't take my word for it. Look this up. The Russian Orthodox Church demanded that after twilight, all Venetian mirrors remain covered with velvet tapestries. You could not look at a mirror by candlelight between midnight and 3 a.m. See, worldwide, look this up, they had a practice, and it's still in old English etiquette books, a protocol and a practice which nearly everyone followed, called the closing of the mirrors. You can look that up. Where people were strongly urged in Russia and England and worldwide to cover mirrors made of crystals, mercury, and silver at night and not look at them. Why? Well, have you ever heard of photographic plates? They used to use for photographs. These photograph plates were made out of a mixture of mercury and silver. So these old types of mirrors were also made of mercury and silver. The same things photographic plates were made of that captured an image. Remember the idea that when you see yourself, your reflection in the mirror, an image of you has traveled on light waves and shows up in the mirror? Well, these old mirrors were made of materials that some have said were stronger, and images on light waves from years before was thought to be striking the mirrors. Where were a lot of these mirrors located? In an area considered to be the old Tartarian Empire. What happened when the communists overthrew the czars? They demanded that people go around and destroy all the old world symbols. And a lot of these mirrors were destroyed. This is just what some people believe. You'll have to look this up for yourself. You ever hear how they did away with the Tartarian bells and buried the architecture? Well, they're saying that the communists smashed these mirrors during the revolution.